Siknanara. 1. The ship was ascending the sacred river, and its bow, crowned with the shape of a lotus, broke through the calm, majestic waves, urging each other from ancient times as if they were events of time in the caravan of time, between two shores on which villages were spread, and palm trees set out in groups and alone, and greenery spread east and west. And the sun was high in the middle of the sky. It sends out wires of light that when the plant is submerged, it flutters, and when it touches the water, it sparkles brightly. The surface of the water was empty except for some fishing boats, the owners of which made the large ship wide as they looked at the image of the lotus, the symbol of the north, with an eye of questioning and denial. At the top of the cabin was a fat man, short in stature, round-faced, long-bearded, white-skinned, wearing a loose-fitting coat and holding a thick staff with a golden handle in his right hand. In front of him sat two men of similar stature and uniform, with one soul close between them all, and the master was looking at the south for a long time. With his eyes darkened by boredom and fatigue, he looked at any fisherman he encountered with a ferocious look, as if he was lost in silence. Then he turned to his feet and asked, saying, "Will the pictures be blown tomorrow, and this heavy peace that has settled over all parts of the south will be dissipated, and these peaceful homes will be terrified, and the war eagle will soar in this air? Security? Ah! I wish these men knew what omen this ship carries for them and their master." The two men shook their heads in agreement with the master's words, and one of them said, "Let there be war, O great Chamberlain, as long as this man whom our Lord has approved of is ruler of the south. He refuses to do anything except place a crown on his head like a king, build palaces like pharaohs, and walk in Thebes cheerfully, not caring about anything." So the Chamberlain began to shake his fangs, and played with his stick between his feet with a movement indicating anger and rage, and said, "There is no Egyptian ruler other than this ruler of the province of Thebes. If we get rid of him, the rule of Egypt will be saved for us forever, and our Lord the King will rest in peace, without fear of anyone rebelling against him." The second of the two men, who had never despaired of one day becoming the ruler of a great city, said enthusiastically, "These Egyptians hate us." The chief chamberlain agreed with his opinion and said in a violent tone, "Yes, yes, and the people of Memphis themselves, the capital of Maulana's kingdom, show obedience and harbor hatred. They have run out of tricks and there is no other way now except the whip and the sword." The first two men smiled, and the second of them also said, "Bless your opinion, wise Chamberlain, for the whip is the only means of understanding with the Egyptians." The three men remained silent for a while, and all that could be heard was the clatter of the oars on the surface of the water. Then one of them noticed that he turned to a fishing boat, in the middle of which stood a boy with his arms muscular, his body bare, except for a shirt covering his middle, and the sun had burned on his skin. He said in astonishment, it was as if these were southerners. "They are derived from the core of their land." The Chamberlain said sarcastically, "Don't be surprised. For among their poets there are those who sing praises of their dark color. Indeed, their color and our color are like clay and dental rays." The Chamberlain said, "Some of our men told me about these southerners, saying, they are arrogant in spite of their color and nakedness, and they claim that they are descended from the loins of the gods, and that their country is the breeding ground of the true pharaohs. Oh my God, I know the cure for all of this. It only decreases when our arms are extended to the borders of their country." The Chamberlain had not finished speaking until he heard one of his men saying, while pointing his finger to the east, "Look, do you see goodness? This is good." So they all looked to where the man was pointing, and they saw a large city surrounded by a great wall, behind which the heads of the obelisks appeared high, as if they were pillars raising the heavenly dome, and on its northern side were seen the towering walls of the temple of Amun, the worshipped Lord of Hosts. And the only thing that caught the eye there was a great giant rising to the sky. So the men were taken away, and the eldest eyebrow frowned and muttered, saying, "Yes, this is good. And I have had the opportunity to see it before, and the days have only increased my desire to go to the point of inspiration for our Lord the King, and to see his victorious procession making its way through its streets." One of the two men said, "And that our Lord Sit the deity should be worshipped with it." The ship slowed its speed, and slowly approached the shore, passing the rich gardens, whose grassy terraces descended to be watered by the sacred river, and behind them loomed palaces of pleasant smell, and to the west of the other shore, crouched the city of eternity, where the immortals lay in the pyramids, terraces, and tombs, covering them. We are all so miserable to die. The ship headed to the port of Thebes, making its way between fishing boats and commercial ships, attracting attention to it due to its size and beauty, and the image of the lotus that adorned its bow, until it was next to the pier, where it dropped its huge dogs, and some guards approached it. And an officer wearing a white linen jacket over his overalls moved to it. One of its men asked, "Where did this ship come from? Do you carry trade?" The man greeted him and said, "Follow me." He took him to the cabin, where the officer realized that he was in the hands of a senior guard from the guards of the northern palace, the palace of the king of the shepherds, as they call him in the south. He bowed out of respect and gave the military salute. The guard raised his hand to return the salute in apparent arrogance and said in a condescending tone, "I am the messenger of Pharaoh, the king of the north and the south, and the son of God Set, Maulana Apophis, to the ruler of Thebes, Prince Siknanara, to deliver to him the report I had brought." The officer listened to the messenger carefully, then saluted again and left. 2. An hour passed, then a dignified man came to the ship, leaning toward the palace, appearing thin, and with a prominent forehead. He bowed a dignified bow to the messenger, and said in a calm voice, "The one who has the honor of receiving you is the chief veil of the southern palace." The man bowed his stately head and said in his thick voice, "I am a great traitor, the chamberlain of the pharaonic palace." Ha said, "My lord will be pleased to receive you immediately." The messenger made a movement and said, "Come with us." The chamberlain Ha came before him, and the man followed him, walking in a slow step, leaning his heavy body on his staff. The two men bowed to him in reverence. Kian felt annoyed and asked himself angrily, shouldn't Siknanara come himself to receive the messenger of Apophis? It bothered him very much that the man behaved like kings in receiving him. They left the ship between two rows of soldiers and officers, and Kian saw on the shore a royal carriage waiting for him, led by war chariots, and other chariots trailing behind him. The soldiers saluted him, and he returned it with pride. He mounted his chariot and a poplar rode beside him. Then the small procession moved on its way to the palace of the ruler of the south. Kian's eyes moved in their sockets to the right and to the left, seeing temples, obelisks, statues, avenues, palaces, markets, and the constant streams of people from all classes. The common people with their semi-naked bodies, the officers in their elegant coats, the priests in their long robes, the secretaries in their loose gowns, and the women in their beautiful costumes, as if everything testified to the greatness of the city, and that it rivaled Memphis itself, the capital of Apophis. The messenger realized at first glance that his procession was attracting attention strongly, and that people were gathering on the sides of the road to watch him, but in coldness and stagnation, and their black eyes began to examine his white face and his long beard with strangeness, denial, and resentment. He felt an inner revolt and intense anger at the cold reception that the great Apophis was given to him in the person of his messenger. It displeased him that he seemed to be a stranger in Thebes after 200 years had passed since his people landed in the land of Egypt and occupied the throne of its king. It angered him that his people would rule for 200 years, during which the South would retain its personality, character, and independence, and not a single Hyksos man would remain in it. Then the procession reached the palace square, which was a spacious square. On its sides were the houses of the government and ministries, and the headquarters of the supreme command of the army, and in its central place appeared the venerable palace, dazzling the eye with its wonderful scenery. It was a great palace like the palace of Memphis itself, and guard soldiers were atop its walls and lined up in 2 rows at its great gate. When the prophet's procession passed it, the music blared with a hymn of greeting, and while the procession was crossing the courtyard, Kian was asking himself, saying, "Will Siknanara receive me with the white crown on his head? He lives the life of kings, follows their behavior, and takes a government for himself like theirs. Will he wear the crown of the south in front of me? Will he do what his ancestors refrained from doing and what his father, Siknanara, himself refrained from doing?" The messenger alighted at the entrance to the long colonnade, and found that he was greeted by the palace veil, the head of the pharaonic guard, and the senior officers. They all saluted him and walked before him to the pharaonic reception hall. The hall leading to the door of the hall was decorated on both sides with statues of the Sphinx, and in its corners stood giant officers from the mighty men of Habu, and the men bowed to the messenger and extended to him. So the chamberlain led him into the hall, and the man followed him, and he saw at the top of the place, not close to the entrance, a pharaonic throne on which sat a man crowned with the crown of the south, holding the scepter and the curved staff in his hand, and to the right of his throne sat 2 men, and to his left 2 men, and he reached the throne, followed by the messenger. He bowed to his lord with reverence, and said in his gentle voice, "My lord, I present to your exalted self the great brow Kian, the messenger of King Ahmose." He bowed to that messenger in greeting, and the king returned his greeting and pointed to him, so he sat on a chair in front of the throne. As for her, he stood to the right of the throne. The king wanted to present to the messenger the men of his kingdom, so he pointed his scepter to the man next to his right and said, "User Aman, the prime minister." Then he pointed to the person next to him and said, "We provide Aman, the high priest of Aman." Then he turned to his left and gestured to the person next to him, saying, "The commander of the fleet is sufficient." He pointed to the person next to him, saying, "Pipi, the commander of the army." When the acquaintance was completed, the king turned his gaze to the messenger, said in a voice whose tones indicated natural highness and exaltation, "You have come to a house that welcomes your person and those who have placed their trust in you." The messenger said, "May God protect you, O venerable ruler, and I am happy that I have been chosen for the embassy mission in your beautiful, historically famous country." He did not miss the king's hearing of his saying, "the venerable ruler," nor did he miss its meaning, but his face showed no trace of what was disturbed within him, and Kian was at that moment giving him a quick, hard look with his bulging eyes, and he saw the Egyptian ruler, a truly majestic man, tall. He had a beautiful, rectangular face, very dark brown, with prominent features in his upper teeth. The 4th episode estimated his age. The king thought that the messenger of Apophis had come for what the northern delegations came for him, that is, to ask for stones and grains, which was what the shepherd kings considered a tribute. The kings of Thebes saw it as a bribe used to stop the evil of the invaders. The king said with his calm and majesty, "I am pleased to listen to you, O great messenger of Apophis." The messenger straightened his seat as if he was preparing to fight and said in his thick voice, "For 200 years, the messengers of the north have not stopped visiting the south, and each time they return satisfied." The king said, "I hope that this beautiful year will last." Kian said, "O ruler, I bring to you 3 pharaonic desires. The first relates to the person of my master Pharaoh, the second to his worshipped Lord Set, and the third to the bonds of affection between the north and the south." So the king turned his attention to him with concern on his face, and the man continued, saying, "In the last days, my lord the king has complained of horrific pains that shake his nerves at night, and disgusting sounds that deafen his generous ears, which have made him a prey to sleep and despair. He called his doctors to him and told them what happens to him at night, so they examined him carefully. But they all returned from examining him in confusion and ignorance, and in their opinion the king was safe and sound. When my master despaired, he went to the prophet of the temple of Set, and the sage realized his illness, and told him, the source of all his pain is that the bellowing of seahorses trapped in the south seeps into his heart, and he assured him that there is no cure. He can only kill her. The messenger knew that the trapped horses were in a good, holy pool, so he sneaked to look at the ruler's face to ascertain the effect of his words, but he found him motionless and solid, albeit flushed with redness. He waited for the man to comment on his words, but he did not say a word, and seemed to be listening and waiting. The messenger said, "While my lord fell ill and saw, as the sleeper sees, our worshipped lord, Set, visiting him with his majesty and light, and he admonished him, saying, 'Is it possible for the entire south to be devoid of a temple in which my name is mentioned?' So my lord swore to ask his friend, the ruler of the south, to build a temple in Thebes next to the temple of Amun." The messenger remained silent, but Siknanara remained silent, and this time it seemed to him that he was taken by surprise, and that he was surprised by something that he had not thought of. Khayan did not mean that he was upset with the king, and perhaps he was motivated by a desire to provoke him. The chamberlain, Hor, realized the danger of the demands, so he leaned down to his master's ear and whispered, saying, "It is better for my master not to discuss with the messenger now." The king shook his head in agreement and realized what his chamberlain was aiming at. Khayan thought that the chamberlain was telling his master what to say, so he waited a little, but the king said, "Do you have another report to convey?" Khayan said, "O venerable ruler, my lord has learned that you crown your head with the white crown of Egypt." He was appalled by this, and saw that it was not compatible with the traditional reasons of affection and friendship that bind the pharaonic family to your new family. Siknanara said in astonishment, "But the white crown is the headdress of the rulers of the south." The messenger said with certainty and determination, "Rather, it was the crown of kings among them, and that is why your glorious father did not think about wearing it, because he knows that there is only one king in this valley who is entitled to be crowned, and I hope, O noble ruler, that you do not lose sight of what my lord's remark indicates of a sincere desire to strengthening the good ties between the families of Memphis and Thebes." Khayan was silent. The silence was corrupted once again, and Siknanara was immersed in sad contemplations, his chest weighed down by the harsh demands of the king of the shepherds that were attacking the places of faith in his heart and the place of pride in himself. And the effect of this was evident in his abstinence and the stagnation that appeared on the faces of the men of his kingdom around him, and he appreciated our advice, but he did not improvise an answer and said in a voice that despite everything remained calm, "O messenger, your message contains a dangerous speech that affects our faith and our traditions, so I think I will reveal my opinion about it to you tomorrow." Khayan said, "The best opinion is that which is preceded by advice." So Siknanara turned to the chamberlain Ha and said, "The messenger advanced to the pavilion prepared for him." So the messenger stood up with his short, huge body, bowed in greeting, and then went walking in arrogance and greatness. 3. The king sent for his crown prince, Prince Ahmose, and the prince came in a hurry that indicated his desire to know the message of the chamberlain of Apophis. He greeted the king with reverence, and took his place to his right. The king turned to him and said, "I have sent for you, O prince, to inform you of the message of the messenger of the north, so that you may see we have your opinion, and the matter is very serious, so listen to me." Then the king narrated to his crown prince what the messenger Khayan had said in clear detail, and the prince listened to his father with great interest, evident in his good countenance, which resembled his father in the color of his skin, his features, and the prominence of his upper teeth. Then the king turned his eyes to those present, and said, "Here you are, gentlemen, you see that in order to please Apophis we must remove this crown, slaughter the sacred seahorses, and build a temple in which I will not be worshipped besides the temple of Amun, so advise me what to do." The dissatisfaction evident on their faces was indicative of the anxiety that was simmering in their chests, and the chamberlain was the first to speak, so he said, "My lord, what I detest more than these desires themselves is the spirit that dictated them, for it is the spirit of a master who dictates to his servant, and a king who preys on his people. I see it as nothing but a renewed image of that ancient conflict between Thebes and Memphis. These seek to enslave the other, and the other cling to their independence as long as they can. There is no doubt that it would displease the shepherds and their king if the kingdom of Thebes remained with its doors closed without their rulers. Perhaps they are not convinced of what they claim, that this kingdom an independent state subordinate to their crown. They wanted to nullify the manifestations of its independence and control its doctrine, so that it would then be easy for them to destroy it." In his speech, Ha was strong and frank. The king mentioned the history of the harassment of the rulers of Thebes by the shepherd kings, and how these people used to repel their evil by returning favors, gifts, and pretending to be submissive in order to protect the south from their incursion and evil. His family had an advantage in this path, and what an advantage, until his father, Siknanara, was able to train the forces of a great secret to preserve the independence of his kingdom, if the trick and the pretense of loyalty in his voice did not work. Then Commander Kaf said, "My lord, I see that it is not permissible to accept any of these demands. How can we accept that our Lord removes his crown from his head? How do we kill sacred horses to please an enemy who humiliated our people? And how do we build a temple to the Lord of evil that those shepherds worship? The high priest Ahmose said, My lord, the Lord Amun does not accept that a temple to the evil god Set be built next to his temple, nor that his pure land be irrigated with the blood of sacred mares, nor that the protector of his kingdom be removed from his crown, as he was the first ruler of the south whose head was crowned by his command. No, my lord, Amun is never satisfied with that, and he is waiting for someone to emerge at the head of an army of his sons to liberate the north and achieve the unity of the homeland, so it will return to what it was in the era of the previous kings. Excitement ran through Commander Bibi's veins like blood, and he stood with his tall stature and broad shoulders, then said in his loud voice, My lord, our great men were truthful in what they said, and I am certain that these demands are intended only to make us accustomed and to train us to humiliation and submission. Is there any evidence behind why this lowly savage, our descendant from the far reaches of the muddy deserts, would demand of our king to take off his crown, worship the Lord of evil, and slaughter the sacred mares? In the past, shepherds asked for money, so we did not give them our money. But now, they covet our freedom and honor, and without that, death is easy and pleasant for us. Our people in the north are slaves who plow the land and are burned by the tongues of whips. We hope that one day we will save them from the torment they are suffering from. We must not willingly go to their miserable fate. The king remained silent, and he listened intently and concealed his emotions by looking down. Prince Ahmose tried to see his face but was unable, and his inclinations were with Commander Bibi, so he said violently, My lord. Apophis greedily looks at our national pride, and refuses to do anything except humiliate the south as he was humiliated. The north, but the south, which did not accept humiliation and whose enemy was at the height of its power, will not accept it now. Who says that we are neglecting what our ancestors were keen to preserve and care for? User Amun, the prime minister, was the least moderate among the people, and his policy was always directed at avoiding the anger of the shepherds or exposure to their barbaric forces, so that he could devote himself to developing the wealth of the south, investing in the resources of Nubia and the eastern desert, and training a strong, invincible army. He feared the consequences of the rush of the crown prince and the army commander, so he directed his words to the men of the kingdom, Remember, my lords, that the shepherds are people who plunder, and even if they ruled Egypt for 200 years, they would still be dazzled by gold, which would humiliate their souls and distract them from noble goals. Then Commander Bibi shook his head with the shining helmet and said, O great man, we have lived with the people long enough to know their souls. They are people who, if they wanted something, asked for it with a frank tongue without intermediary, with trickery and politeness. They used to ask for gold and it would be brought to them, but today they are asking for our freedom. The minister said, We must wait now until our army is complete. The commander said, Our army, in its current state, is capable of repelling the enemy. Prince Ahmose looked at his father and found him still knocking down. He said excitedly, What is the point of talking? Our army may lack some men and some equipment, but Apophis does not wait for us to complete our preparations. He presents to us demands that if we accept them, we will condemn ourselves to collapse and extinction. There is not a single man in the south who would prefer surrender to death. Let us proudly reject these demands and raise our heads before those shepherds with great dignity. Long beards and white skin that the sun will not purify. The people were affected by the enthusiasm of the young prince, and their faces showed excitement and anger, as if they were tired of talking and wanted to make a decisive decision. The king raised his head and looked to his crown prince, and asked in his sublime tone, saying, Do you think we should reject Apophis' demands, O prince? Ahmose said confidently and violently, with all firmness and pride, My lord. And if rejection leads to war? Ahmose said, We fight, my lord. Commander Bibi said with no less enthusiasm than the prince, We fight until we repel the enemy from our borders, and if our lord wishes, we fight until we liberate the north and remove from the land of the Nile the last man of the white shepherds with long, dirty beards. So the king turned to the high priest Nufaman and asked him, And you, "Your Holiness, what do you see?" The venerable sheikh said, "I see, my lord, that whoever tries to extinguish this sacred flame is an infidel." King Siknanara smiled satisfied and turned to his minister Uzurayman, saying, "Only you remain, O minister." Then the man began to say, "My lord, I did not advise to wait out of hatred or fear of war, but to complete the army, which I hope will achieve the goal of my lord's glorious family, which is to liberate the Nile Valley from the iron grip of the shepherds. And if Apophis truly covets our freedom, then I am the first to call for the war." So Siknanara looked at the faces of his men, and said in a voice that indicated determination and strength, "O men of the south, I share your emotions, and I believe that Apophis is harassing us and aspires to rule us through fear or war, and we are a people who do not submit to fear and welcome war. The north has been the prey of shepherds for 200 years. They absorbed the best of its land and humiliated its men. As for the south, it has been struggling for 200 years, not forgetting its highest goal, which is the liberation of the entire valley. Will it turn back on its heels at the first threat, neglect its right, and cast its freedom as a deposit in the hands of the insatiable greedy? No, men of the south, I will reject Apophis' humiliating demands, and I will wait for what he responds to us. If peace, then peace, if war, then war." The king stood up, and the men rose as one and bowed in reverence. Then he left the hall slowly, followed by Prince Camus and the Grand Chamberlain. 4. The king went to Queen Ahmose's suite, and when the woman saw him approaching her in his formal attire, she realized that the messenger of the north had come with a big matter. Interest appeared on her beautiful brown face, and she stood up to meet him with her tall, graceful stature, and raised questioning eyes to him. He said to her calmly, "Ahmose, it seems to me, war is closing in on us on the horizon." Her black eyes became worried and she murmured, saying in astonishment, "Are you talking about war, my lord?" He bowed his head in the affirmative, and told her what the messenger had said about betrayal, and what his men thought of him, and what his resolve had settled upon. He spoke to her while his eyes did not turn from her face, and he read on his page the pity, hope, and surrender that burned within her soul. She said to him, "You have chosen the path that someone like you should choose." He smiled and patted her shoulder, then said to her, "Let us go to our Holy Mother." Then they walked together, side by side, to the suite of Queen Mother Tutishuri, husband of the former King Siknanara, and she was in her private room, reading as usual. Queen Tutishuri was 60 years old, and her countenance showed nobility, glory, and majesty. Her vitality was intense, and her activity prevailed with greatness. The only traces of it affected her except white hairs crowning her cheeks, and a slight wilting on her cheeks. Her eyes remained clear and her body maintained its charm and grace. She participated in all members of the Tiber family in the protrusion of her upper teeth, that protrusion that all the people of the south were fascinated by and worshipped. Following the death of her husband, the queen abdicated from power as required by law, leaving the reins of Tiber to her son and his wife, but she remained the opinion that was referred to in judgments, and the heart that inspired hope. And the struggle, and in her free time she devoted herself to reading, and she would constantly read the books of Khufu and the Stoat, the books of the dead, and the history of the glorious eras immortalized by the likes of Men's, Khufu, and Amenemhet. The Mother Queen had great fame throughout the south, and there was no man or woman who did not know her, love her, and swear by her beloved name. She instilled in those around her, led by her son, King Siknanara, and her grandson, Ahmose, the love of Egypt, its south and north, and the hatred of the usurping shepherds who put the venerable eras to the worst end, and she taught everyone that their lofty goal, which they must prepare themselves to achieve, is to liberate the Nile Valley from the grip of tyrannical shepherds, and she advised the priests of various kinds to their classes of temple men and school teachers must always remind people of the usurping north and the usurping enemy, and the sins they committed by which they humiliated the people, enslaved them, plundered their land, seized its resources, and brought them down to the level of the animals working in the fields. If in the south there is the embers of a sacred fire that kindles hearts and revives hopes, then the credit is in she stimulated her patriotism and wisdom, which is why the entire south sanctified her and people called her the Holy Mother Tutishuri. just as believers call the goddess Isis, and they sought refuge in her name from the evil of despair and defeat. This is the mother whom Siknanara and Ahotep went to. She was expecting that visit after she learned of the arrival of the messenger of the king of the shepherds. She mentioned the messengers that the shepherd kings used to send to her late husband to ask for gold, grains, and stones. They used to ask for a tribute that the follower would pay to the follower. Her husband used to send ships loaded to protect himself from the barbaric power of the people, and to multiply his hidden activity in forming the army, which was the most precious thing that Siknanara inherited from his son and successor. She mentioned this while she was waiting for the king. When he and his wife came, she spread out her thin arms to them and they kissed her hands. The king sat to her right and the queen to her left. She asked her son, with a gentle smile, "What does Apophis want?" He said in an angry tone, "O mother, he wants goodness and all that she owes. Rather, there is nothing more honorable than this. This time he is compromising with us for our honor." She shook her head between the two kings and was horrified, and said in a voice that remained calm despite everything, "His ancestors, despite their greed, were content with granite and gold." Queen Ahotep said, "As for him, O mother, he wants us to kill the seahorses whose sound disturbs his sleep, and to build a temple to his lord set next to the temple of Amun, and for our lord to remove the white crown." Siknanara agreed with what Ahotep said, and told his mother the news of the messenger and his message. Denial appeared on her majestic face, and the twisting of her lips indicated resentment and indignation. She asked the king, saying, "What did you answer him, my son?" "I haven't given him my answer yet." "And have you come up with an opinion?" "Yes, I reject all of his demands." Whoever makes these demands does not remain silent in rejecting them. And whoever is able to reject them all does not fear the consequences of his rejection. So he waged war against you. I waged war against him. The war rang in her ears with a strange ringing that awakened old memories in her heart, and she remembered days like these when her husband was heartbroken and complained to her about his anxiety and wished he had a strong army with which to repel his enemies' greed. As for her son, he spoke about the war with courage, determination, and confidence. Times had changed and hope was renewed. She glanced at the queen's face and found it pale. She realized that she was suffering from confusion, and that the queen's hope and the wife's pity were being thrown at her without mercy. She herself was a queen and a mother, but she could only say what the people's teacher and their holy mother should say. She asked him, "Is she capable of war?" "O my lord." He said firmly, "Yes, mother, I have a valiant army." "Can this army free Egypt from the shackles?" "He can at least repel the aggression of the herdsmen from the kingdom of the south." Then he shook his shoulders in disdain and said with anger, "Mother, as long as we have dealt with those shepherds year after year, politeness has not succeeded in silencing their greed, and they have continued to eye our kingdom with greed and avarice, and the judiciary has heated up. And I believe that courage is more important to us than conciliation and politeness. I will take this step and see what happens." Then Totishiri smiled and said proudly, "May Amun bless this proud and high soul." "What do you say, mother?" "I say, my son, walk on your path, may God protect you and may my prayers bless you. This is our goal and this is what should be done for the boy whom Amun chose to achieve the eternal hopes of Thebes." Siknanara rejoiced, and his face shone with light, and he fell on Totishiri's head, kissing her forehead, and she kissed his left cheek, and she kissed Ahotep's right cheek, and blessed them both, and they returned from her happy and happy. The messenger Kian announced that Siknanara would receive him the next day, and at the appointed time, the king went to the reception hall, followed by his chief chamberlain. There he found waiting for him around his throne was the prime minister, the high priest, and the commanders of the army and the fleet. They rose to receive him and bowed down before him, and he sat on the throne and allowed them to sit. Then the door attendant shouted, announcing the arrival of Messenger Kian, and the man entered with his short, fat body and long beard, walking with a swaggering gait. He was asking himself, what is behind the shura? Islam or war? Then he reached the throne and bowed in greeting to the person sitting on it. The king returned the greeting and allowed him to sit, saying, "I hope you spent a happy night." "It was a good night, thanks for your kind hospitality." He looked at the king's head and saw the white crown of Egypt above it. His chest constricted and anger raged in his heart. It was hard for him to challenge him as well as the ruler of the south. The king, for his part, was not keen on complimenting the messenger because he was not ignorant of what his rejection of the demands meant, so he wanted to express his opinion frankly. Firmly and harshly, he said, "O Messenger Kian, I have carefully studied the demands you bring to us, and consulted with the men of my kingdom about them, and we all agreed to reject them." Kian did not expect this clear and decisive rejection, so he was taken aback, and he looked at Siknir with astonishment and denial, and his face became like a camel. The king continued, saying, "I found these demands affecting our faith and honor, and we do not allow anyone to touch our faith and honor." Kian woke up from his astonishment and said calmly and with pride as if he had not heard what the king said, "If my lord asks me, why does the ruler of the south refuse to build a temple for you, what should I tell him? Tell him that the people of the south worship Amun alone. And if he asked me, why don't they kill the seahorses that disturb my sleep? Tell him that the people of the south sanctify it." "Wow, isn't Pharaoh more sacred than seahorses?" Siknir nodded carefully as if he was thinking about the answer, then he said in a firm tone, "Apophis is sacred to you, and these mares are sacred to us." A wave of relief spread through the souls of the king's men at this violent answer. As for Kian, his anger increased, but he did not surrender to his authority. He restrained himself and said calmly, "O venerable ruler, your father was ruler of the south and did not wear this crown. Do you see yourself as having a right other than what he was? Does your father see himself? I inherited the south from him, and this has been his crown since ancient times, and I have the right to crown my head with it. But in Memphis, another man crowns his head with the double crown of Egypt, and calls himself Pharaoh of Egypt. What do you think of what he claims for himself? I see that he and his predecessors usurped the kingdom." Kian ran out of patience and said with anger and contempt, "O ruler, do not think that wearing the crown will elevate you to the ranks of kings, for kingship after and before is power and authority, and I see in your statements nothing but disdain for the good ties that linked your fathers and grandfathers to our kings, and a tendency toward challenge whose consequences are uncertain." Anger appeared on the faces of the courtiers, but the king maintained his calm and said slowly, "O messenger, we do not hasten evil, but if our honor is harassed, we will be harassed. We do not back down and do not prefer safety. It is among our virtues that we do not overestimate our strength, so do not expect to hear from me boasting and being proud. But know that my fathers and grandfathers preserved the independence of this kingdom to the best of their ability, and I will not neglect what they promised God and people to preserve." Kian's sharp lips formed a sarcastic smile concealing bitter hatred, and he said in a meaningful tone, "As you wish, O ruler, and all I have to do is report it, and you will bear the consequences of your words." The king bowed his head and did not speak, then he stood up to announce the end of the council, and everyone stood in reverence until the door disappeared from their sight. 6. The king was aware of the danger of the situation, so he wanted to visit the temple of Amun, to call on the worshipped Lord and announce the struggle in the sacred courtyard, and he declared his will to his minister and his men, so their crowds of ministers, pimps, chamberlains, and senior officials went to the temple of Amun to receive the king. And the unaware Thebes became aware of what was going on behind the walls. Its palaces were smelling, and many whispered that the messenger of the north had come arrogantly and angry, and it spread among the Thebans that Siknir would visit the temple of Amun to gain his opinion and ask him for help. So large crowds of men and women went to the temple, and many people joined them, surrounding the temple and rushing to the paths leading to it. There was seriousness, interest, and aspiration on their faces. Questions swirled among them and conversation took place on their tongues, each explaining the matter as he saw it. Then the pharaonic caravan came, led by a group of guards, followed by the king's will and other carriages carrying the queen, princes, and princesses from the royal house. a wave of enthusiasm and joy spread through the people's souls. They waved their hands to their king and applauded him and said Allahu Akbar, and Siknanara smiled at them and waved his scepter at them, and it was not lost on anyone that the king was wearing a war dress with shining armor, so the people became very eager to hear the news, and the king entered the courtyard of the temple, followed by his family, women and men, and they were received by the temple priests, ministers, and commanders. With prostration, Naguib shouted in a loud voice, saying, "The Lord prolong the life of the king and preserve the kingdom of Thebes." The people enthusiastically chanted his chant and chanted it again, so the king greeted him by raising his hand to his head and with a smile from his wide mouth. Then the entire crowd advanced to the hall of the altar, and the soldiers offered a bull as a sacrifice to the Lord. Then they all walked around the altar and the hall of columns, and there they stood in 2 rows, and the king gave his scepter to his crown prince, Prince Ahmose, and walked to the holy staircase and ascended it to the Holy of Holies. He crossed the holy threshold with humble steps, and closed the door behind him as if dusk had overtaken him. He bowed his head and took off his crown in reverence for the purified place, and advanced toward the sanctuary. The worshipped Lord, with his legs sluggish in awe, then prostrated at his feet, kissed them, and remained silent for a moment until his troubled breathing calmed down. He said in a low voice, as if in a whisper, "O Lord who is worshipped, Lord of the glorious Thebes, and Lord of the lords of the Nile, grant me mercy and strength from you, for today I am exposed to a dangerous consequence. She didn't stress me, I was ashamed without her. It is defending Thebes and fighting your enemy and our enemy who fell upon us from the northern desert in barbaric crowds that destroyed our homes, humiliated the necks of our people, closed the doors of your temples, and usurped our throne. Grant me your help, I will repel their armies, chase away their remnants, and purify the valley of their brute force, so that it will only be ruled by your brown sons, and only your name will be mentioned in it." The king remained silent and waited for a while, then immersed himself once again in a long, fervent prayer, resting his forehead on the feet of the statue. Then he raised his head in reverence until he saw the noble, adored face, shrouded in majesty and silence, as if it were the curtain of tomorrow hiding the events of judgment behind it. The king appeared before his people, placing the white crown on his sweat-slicked forehead, and they all prostrated before him. Prince Ahmose approached him with his scepter, took it in his right hand and said in a loud voice, "O men of glorious Thebes, perhaps our enemy, in this hour about which I am speaking to you, will mobilize his army on the borders of our kingdom to storm our homes. Come, come, all of you to the struggle, and let the motto of each one of you be to do your best in your work, so that our army can be steadfast and fight. I have prayed to the Lord and asked him for help, and the Lord does not care about the people of his country and his children." Everyone shouted in a voice that shook the walls of the temple, "The Lord has supported our king Siknanara." As the king was about to walk, the priest of Amun approached him and said, "May my lord wait a little while so that I can present to him a sacred gift?" The king said, smiling, "As you wish, your holiness." The priest made a special reference to 2 priests, so they went to the waste room, and returned carrying a small box of gold that everyone looked at, and Nofa Amun approached them and opened the box patiently and gently, and the eyes saw inside it a pharaonic crown, the double crown of Egypt. So the eyes widened in astonishment and their gazes exchanged, and Nofa Amun turned his gaze to his master and said in a shaking voice, "My lord, this is the crown of King Ahmose." Then the people shouted, saying, "The crown of King Ahmose," and Nofa said with enthusiasm and strength, "Yes, my lord, this is the crown of Ahmose, the last pharaoh to rule a united Egypt and Nubia before the shepherds invaded our homeland. The wisdom of the Lord wished for his vengeance to befall our country during his reign, so this noble crown fell from his head after he suffered the most severe hardships in defense, so he lost the throne and its owner and retained his honor, so our ancestors raised it to this temple to take its place among the sacred relics. And its owner died a hero and martyr, so he is worthy of your great head, and I crown you with it, O King Siknanara, O son of Tutashuri, the Holy Mother. I call upon you as King of Upper and Lower Egypt and the country of Nubia. And I call on you in the name of the Lord Amun and in the memory of Ahmose and the people of the south to mobilize to fight your enemy and liberate the pure and beloved Nile Valley. The high priest approached the king and took off the white crown of Egypt from his head and handed it to one of the men of the priesthood. Then he raised the double crown of Egypt between applauding and glorifying it and placed it on his curly head. Then he shouted, "Long live the Pharaoh of Egypt!" The people chanted his slogan, and a priest rushed out of the temple and chanted for Pharaoh Siknanara of Egypt, and the Thebans chanted with raging enthusiasm. Then he chanted to fight the shepherds, and the people answered him with voices like thunder, and they were certain of what they had doubted about him. Pharaoh greeted the priests, then headed towards the door of the temple, followed by his family, the men of his palace, and the faces of the southern kingdom. 7. Upon Pharaoh's arrival at his palace, he called for a meeting with his prime minister, the chief priest, the chief chamberlain of the palace, and the commanders of the army and fleet, and said to them, "The ship of King Ahmose is sailing towards the north quickly, and we will be attacked as soon as it crosses the southern borders. So we should not waste an hour of our time." He turned to the fleet commander, Kaf, and said, "I hope you find your mission easy on the surface of the water. The shepherds are our students in fighting on ships. Prepare your ships for war and sail them toward the north." Commander Kaf saluted his master and left the place in a hurry. The king turned to Commander Bibi and said, "Commander Bibi, the main force of our army is camped in Thebes, so take it to the north, and I will join you at the head of a force of my strong guards, and I pray to the Lord to strengthen my soldiers. They are worthy of the mission entrusted to them, and do not forget, Commander, to send a messenger to Panopolis on our northern border to alert the garrison to the danger facing it so that it is not taken by surprise." So the commander saluted his master and went on, and the king turned his face to the faces of the prime minister, the chief priest, and the head of the veil. Then he said to them, "The duty of defending the rear of our army will be placed on your shoulders, gentlemen. So each of you should carry out your duty with the competence and sincerity that I have entrusted you with." They said in one voice, "We are all a sacrifice for the king and for Thebes." So Siknanara said, "O Nupharaman, send your men to the villages and countries to urge my people to wage jihad. And you, O Uzuraman, call upon the rulers of the regions and command them to recruit the strong and able from among my people. As for you, O Ha, I entrust you with my household, and let it be for my son Ahmose as you were for me." The king greeted his men and left the place, going to his private suite to bid farewell to his family before departing. He sent for them all, and Queen Ahotep, Queen Tetisheri, Prince Ahmose, his wife Princess Siknanara, her young son Ahmose, and their young daughter Princess Nefertari came. He received them cordially and seated them around him, and he felt tenderness flowing from between his ribs, and he went on. He turns his eyes to the faces he loves most to his heart, as if he sees one face repeated, the only difference between which is age. Tutisheri is 60, Ahotep, like her husband, is 40, Ahmose and Siknanara is 25, Ahmose is only 10 years old, and his sister Nefertari is 2 years younger than that, but there was a face among them in which those two black eyes and that mouth that tended to protrude above, and that russet tan that gave it health and beauty, sparkled in it. A smile appeared on the king's wide mouth and he said, "Let us sit together for an hour before departure." Tutisheri said, "I pray to the Lord, my son, that it will be a journey to clear victory." Siknanara said, "I am very hopeful of victory, mother." The king saw the crown prince in his war dress, and realized that he thought he was going out with him, so he asked him, ignoring him, "Why are you wearing this dress?" The young man's face appeared astonished, as if he was not expecting this question, and he said with astonishment, "For the reason for which you are wearing it, my lord." "Did you receive my order to do so?" "I thought the matter did not require an order, my lord." "You made a mistake, Ahmose." Horror appeared on the young man's face and he said, "Am I deprived of the honor of fighting a good battle, my lord? Battlefields do not have honor over other fields, and you will remain on my throne, Ahmose, to watch over the happiness of our kingdom and provide our army with men and supplies." Then the young man's face sank, and he bowed his head as if he was burdened by the king's order, and Tutisheri wanted to comfort him, so she said gently, "Ahmose, carrying out the burdens of government is not an easy job that shames a person, and it is a job worthy of someone like you." Here the king put his hand on his crown prince's shoulder and said, "Listen to me, Ahmose. We are heading towards a fierce war in which we hope to win, with God's help, and liberate our beloved country from the shackles with which it is bound. However, it is wise to appreciate all the consequences. Our sage, our stoat, said, 'Don't put all your arrows in one quiver.'" The king remained silent, and the silence became corrupted, and no one said a word until the king resumed, saying, "If the wisdom of the Lord wills that our struggle should end in failure, then our struggle must never stop. Listen to me, all of you. If Siknanara falls, do not despair, for Ahmose will succeed his father, and if Ahmose falls, he will succeed him. Ahmose the younger, and if this army of ours is exhausted, then Egypt will be full of men. If Ptolemy falls, let it fight Cactus. If Thebes is stormed, let Ahmose, Sin, and Begeer revolt. Or the south falls into the hands of shepherds. There is Nubia, where we have strong, loyal men. Tututuri will take charge of the children as she took care of the fathers and grandfathers. I will not warn you. Except for one enemy, despair." The king's words had a strong impact on everyone's hearts, until young Ahmose, Nefertari, and Gemma became confused and astonished at how their grandfather spoke to them in such a serious tone for the first time. Queen Ahotep's eyes filled with tears, and Siknanara became upset and said in a tone that was not devoid of reproach, "Are you crying, Ahotep? Look at our mother's courage. Totokiri." Then he looked at Ahmose and was very burdensome towards him. The boy was a true image of his grandfather, so he pulled him towards him and asked him with a smile, "Who is the enemy that we should beware of, O Ahmose?" The boy said, not understanding the meaning of what he was saying, "Despair." The king laughed and kissed him again, then he stood up and said gently, "Let us embrace." Then he embraced them all, beginning with Tetokiri, his wife, Ahotepe, and Sechemose, his son-in-law, then Ahmose and Nefertari. Then he turned to Kamu, who was standing in a rigid and submissive manner. He extended his hand to him, and he squeezed it tightly. Then he leaned over it, kissed it, and said in a low voice, "May peace be with you, father." The king waved his hand to them and left the place with firm feet, determination, and courage evident on his face. The king went out at the head of a force of his guards and met in the palace square with the crowds of the excited people of Thebes. It seemed that all the people of Thebes, men, women, and children, had moved to the palace square, greeting their king and cheering for those who came out seeking to liberate the valley. Siknanara made his way between their clashing waves, heading to the northern gate of Thebes, and there he found the priests, ministers, veils, notables, and senior officials bid farewell to him. They prostrated before his procession and chanted his name for a long time. The last voice the king heard was the voice of Nufar saying to him, "I will receive you, my lord, after a while, and your head is crowned with laurel." "O God, respond." The king passed the great gate of Thebes on his way to the north, leaving behind the walls of the great city. He was greatly affected by what he saw and what he heard. He felt the danger of the great work ahead of him, and how it would involve making his people happy or miserable for a long time. He placed the fate of the people in his hand. He faced the horrific dangers from which his father took a leisurely and patient stance. He was not one of the luxurious rulers, but his character included steadfastness, valor, austerity, and religiosity. He had great hope and strong confidence in his people. His army joined the camp in the town of Shanhu, north of Thebes, before evening, and Commander Bibi received him at the head of the city. The commander of the squads, and his senses were weakened due to fatigue and illness, and his condition was not lost on the king, so he said to him, "I see you are tired, commander." The commander was pleased with his lord's remark and said, "We were able, my lord, to gather here the garrisons of Hermes, Habu, and Thebes, and I formed an army numbering more than 20,000 fighters." The king rode his will between the soldiers' tents, and a wave of joy and enthusiasm spread through them, and cheers were heard for him in the camp north of the town of Shanhu. Then he returned to the royal tent with Commander Bibi in the company of him. The king was reassured about his army, which had spent the best efforts of its youth in training it, So he said, "Our army is valiant." So how do you think a pimp feels? They are all optimistic, my lord, and enthusiastic about war, and not one of them expresses great admiration for the historically famous Olkasi band. The king said, "I share this admiration with you, and now listen to me. We should not waste any time except what is required by the necessity of resting this number of soldiers. We must meet our enemy if he really attacks us in the steep valley between Panopolis and Tolos, for it is a very rugged valley. The paths are narrow, and the military advantage is for whoever controls Aili, and the Nile course is narrow, so we can help our fleet during its clash with the enemy. We will start marching, my lord, before dawn." He nodded his head in agreement and said, "We must reach Panopolis and camp in its valley before Kian returns to Memphis." Then the king invited his pimps to meet him. 8. The army moved before dawn, preceded by the scout force to its targets, and preceded by the chariot squad consisting of 200 chariots headed by Pharaoh, followed by the spear squad, then the bow and arrow squad, then the small arms squad, and the supply wagons, weapons, and tents. The fleet sailed at the same time to the north, and it was dark. It was so intense that only the rays of the watchful stars and the lights of torches alleviated its darkness. They reached the city of Kasi, and they all rose to meet Pharaoh and his army. The peasants rushed from the furthest fields carrying palm fronds, winds, and jugs of beer. They walked with the army, cheering for it and offering the soldiers flowers and cups of delicious beer. They did not leave it until it became too deep. On the way, the darkness of the night faded and the calm blue light of dawn poured out onto the eastern horizon, presenting the signs of light. Then dawn broke and the light flooded the world, and the army continued on its way until it reached Katut just before the afternoon, so it rested there for a while among the enthusiastic people who were waiting for it. The king decided that the army's resting place would be in Tanthira, so he issued his order to resume the march, and the army continued until it reached Tanthira when darkness fell, and there it surrendered to a deep sleep. He would wake up before dawn and strike the ground until darkness fell, day after day, until he camped in Abydos. Scouts were wandering north of the city, and officers from among its men saw from a long distance people striking the ground, so he ran at the head of a group of his men toward the oncoming ones. Whenever the valley descended, he became clear. He had the command and saw winding lines of peasants walking in groups carrying their light belongings, and some of them were driving sheep or bulls, their appearance indicating misery and homelessness. The man was astonished and blocked the path of those advancing among them and was about to ask them, but a man among them shouted to him, "Help, soldier, catch us, we have perished." The officer shouted annoyed, "Are you asking for help? What scares you?" Many of them answered in one breath, "Shepherds." "Shepherds." The first man said, "We are the people of Panopolis and Ptolemy. A soldier from the border came to us and said to us, 'The army of shepherds is attacking the border with great forces that will soon flow into our town.' He advised us to migrate to the north. Panic destroyed the country and the fields, and we all rushed to our homes, calling out to the women and children and carrying what was light to carry. Then we left the country behind us, fleeing, and we have not felt any rest since yesterday morning." Their faces showed fatigue and distress, so the officer said to them, "Rest for a while, then continue walking, and soon this quiet valley will turn into a battlefield." The man tied the reins of his horse and rode with him to the commander's tent in Abydos, and informed him of the news. Pepe immediately went to the king and told him the news. He received him with astonishment and annoyance and shouted, "How did this happen? Did the betrayal of Memphis reach this short time?" Bibi said angrily, "There is no doubt, my lord, that our enemy mustered his army on our borders before he sent us his messenger. He was lurking for us, and he only presented his demands to us while hoping that we would reject them. When Kian crossed our borders returning, he issued his order to the amassed armies to attack. This is the explanation. Reasonable for that rapid and violent attack." Then King Siknarara's face turned yellow with anger and rage, and he said, "Then Panopolis and Ptolemy have fallen. Yes, alas, my lord, and the valor of our small garrison is of no use in defending them. The king shook his head regretfully and said, we lost our best battlefield. This will not affect the extraordinary courage of our soldiers. The king thought carefully, then said to the commander of his armies, we must completely evacuate Abydos and 10th IRA. A question appeared on Bibi's face, and the king said, we will not defend these cities. So Bibi realized what his master meant. Does my lord want to meet the enemy in the Hyksos valley? This is what I want. There, the enemy can be attacked from several directions, and there are natural fortresses throughout the valley. I will leave for him in the cities that we are evacuating, gangs that will attack him without engaging him in combat, thus hindering his advance until we strengthen our positions. Come on, Bibi, send your messengers to the cities to evacuate them. Order the commander to retreat immediately, and waste no time, for the rope of the swing on which the fate of our people swings has one end in the hands of Apophis. 9. The herald shouted to the people of Abydos, Bartha, and Tanthera, carry your possessions and your money and march to the south, for your homes have become a merciless battlefield. The people knew who the shepherds were and what their work was. Fear took over them and they hastened to take their money and their possessions, piling them into carts pulled by bulls, and driving the cows and sheep in the market of a hasty man. They gathered their hair and rushed towards the south, abandoning their lands and homes, as if their ties had been torn apart from grief and regret. Whenever their journey progressed, they cast their dark eyes back, and their hearts longed for them to return to their homelands. Then fears terrified them and they found themselves rushing to the unknown that awaited them. On their way they passed some army divisions, and their hearts skipped a beat. There was hope in their chests and in their painful dreams, and their mouths filled with a smile of joy that shone in the atmosphere of their sorrows just as the sun's rays shine through a gap between the clouds that cleared for a moment on the darkest day of the sky. They waved their hands and many shouted, our lands are a stolen deposit. Return them to us, you brave ones. At that time, Pharaoh was supervising the distribution of his forces in the Hyksos Valley and looking with wide-eyed eyes at the crowds of immigrants whose flow was never interrupted. He was sharing their pain as if he were one of them, and multiplying in his pain what the air carried to his ears in terms of their chanting of his name and their supplications to him. Commander Pipi was in constant contact with the scouts, receiving news from them and then relaying it to his master. He was informed of the enemy's attack on Abydos and the stubborn resistance of its small garrison that defeated the last man of them. The next day the messenger carried the news of the Hyksos attack on the city of Bartha and the deceptions it had carried out by the men defending it. Arts of defense and combat in order to disrupt the enemy's advance as long as they could. As for Tanthera, its garrison remained strong against the advancing enemy for hours on end, until it was forced to attack it with large forces, as if attacking an army full of numbers and equipment. Then the scouts and some of the officers who survived from the garrisons of the invaded cities decided that the enemy's forces were likely in number between 50,000 and 70, while the group of wheels is no less than 1,000 wheels, and the king received the last news with strangeness and alarm. Because neither he nor anyone in his army expected that the army of Apophis would have such a large number of wheels, and he said to his commander, how can our wheel division resist this huge number of wheels? Bibi was confused about his situation, and he was asking himself this question, so he said to his master, the Kasi squad will carry out its duty, my lord. The king shook his head in astonishment and said, wheels were not among the shepherds' war machines, so how could their army have many times more than our army? What is painful, my lord, is that the hands that made it were Egyptian. Indeed, it is painful, but are bows useful in resisting a torrent of wheels? Our soldiers, my lord, do not miss their targets, and tomorrow Apophis will see that their arms prevail over his many wheels. That evening, Pharaoh was alone and feeling distressed and distressed. He prayed to the Lord a long, fervent prayer, beseeching him to open his chest, strengthen his heart, and grant victory to him and his army. Everyone sensed the approach of the enemy, so they doubled their vigilance, and slept that night in fear, hoping for the morning to come so that they could throw themselves into the battle of death. 10. The army woke up not long before dawn, And the strong men of the archer-bearers took their fortified places in the field, each group of them supported by a small force of chariots. Siknanara stood in front of his tent with his commander Pepi, amidst a circle of strong men of his guard, and he was saying to them, It is wise to launch the chariot division to confront unmatched forces, but these scattered chariots will help our fortified archers to hit the enemy's knights and horses. There is no doubt that Apophis will begin his attack with the chariots, because the other army divisions will not meet until the battle of the chariots is decided, so let our concern be directed to incapacitate the wheels of the shepherds, so that we can enable our irresistible army divisions to engage in battle and eliminate our enemy. The idea of eliminating the wheels of the enemy was his dream that haunted him, and he used to pray to his Lord Amun in sincerity and hope, saying, O Lord who is worshipped, grant us victory over this obstacle. And support your faithful sons, for if you abandon them today, your name will not be mentioned in your honorable resting place, and the doors of your purified temple will be closed. The king rode his chariot, and Commander Pepi did the same. The pharaonic guards surrounded them, and 100 chariots stood behind them. Then the band of spearmen advanced and closed their ranks to the right of the king and to his left, and everyone was waiting to be called to battle after the forces of archers and chariots that supported them had done their first duty. When the signs of light began to appear, a man from the scouts came and informed the king that the Egyptian fleet clashed with the fleet of shepherds in a heated battle north of Hyksos. The king said to his army commander, Apophis realizes, without a doubt, that he will meet with violent resistance. Therefore, he ordered his fleet to attack so that he could land soldiers behind our positions. Commander Bibi said, The shepherds, my lord, do not master the art of fighting on the decks of ships, and the holy Nile will swallow the corpses of their soldiers, and swallow Apophis' hope of besieging us. Siknanara's confidence in the men of the Theban fleet was great, but he advised the scout leader to be in constant contact with the naval battlefield, and he made the darkness dissipate and the morning dawn, and the field became clear to the searching eyes. Siknanara saw his soldiers, archers, and bows in their hands, and the numbered chariots ready to fight alongside them, and he saw in on the other side, the army of shepherds was spread out by the rising dust, and the enemy was waiting for the dawn to break. As soon as it got dark, the charioteer forces moved in preparation for the battle, then forces from them attacked some of the fortified places in the front, so arrows flew, horses neighed, and the combatants screamed, and other forces rushed, and clashed with the Egyptian archers and some of the chariots. The Egyptians were in fierce fighting, and Siknanara shouted, Now the battle of Thebes begins. Bibi said in a strong voice, Yes, my lord, and our soldiers have made a good start. All eyes were directed to the field to watch the progress of the battle, and they saw the shepherds' chariots attacking a line, then various groups dispersed, attacking the archers with violence and speed, and pounced on any of the Egyptian chariots that came in their way. The dead were falling quickly from both sides in bravery and valor, and the strength of the archers and the strength of their arrows appeared. They were pinning down the attackers, hunting down their knights and horses, and killing them with devastating destruction, until Bibi shouted, saying, If the fighting continued like this, we would overtake the wheeled division in a few days. However, the shepherd forces would attack and fight, then retreat to their camp and attack others so as not to exhaust their forces, while the Egyptians would defend without silence or rest while they were fixed in their positions, and whenever Siknanara saw one of his knights fall or one of his wheels break down, he would shout angrily, Wow! He was sorry, and he was fully aware of the loss that was befalling his army, and the number of units with which the shepherds were attacking began to double. They would attack 3 by 3, then they would attack 6 by 6, then 10 by 10. The fighting intensified, became heated, and was intense, and the number of Hyksos chariots continued to increase, until Siknanara became worried. He said to Bibi, We must confront the increase in enemy forces in a way that restores balance to the field. But, my lord, we must keep our spare wheels until the end of the battle. Don't you see that the enemy attacks us every little while with new forces motivated to fight? I understand the plan, my lord, but we cannot keep up with him due to the abundance of his spare wheels and the lack of ours. Then the king gritted his teeth and said, We never expected him to have this dominance in the wheels, and whatever it is, I cannot leave the archers without help, as there are no archers in my army except them." The king ordered an attack of 20 chariots in 5 units, and they swooped like sweeping eagles and breathed new life into the field. But Apophis wanted to give a harsh response to Siknanara's new campaign, so he sent 20 units to the field, each unit consisting of 5 chariots, and they shook the earth with their clattering, and filled the void with mountains. From the rising dust, the battle spread and blood flowed like a river, and time passed and it did not calm down or abate until the sun reached the middle of the sky. After that, the scouts came and announced to the king the return of the shepherd's fleet after he lost 2 ships in captivity, and another ship sank, so the news of the victory came in. It was time to strengthen the resolve of the Egyptians and strengthen their hearts. And the officers in the fighting teams waiting for their turn to come in the struggle broadcast it. It had an echo of joy in the chests and a surge of enthusiasm in the hearts, but that news also struck the ears of Apophis, so anger seized him, and he changed his slow plan immediately. And he issued his order to the chariot force to attack and retaliate, and Siknanara saw a huge torrent of chariots attacking his brave archers from everywhere, cutting into them with his sharp nails. The king was extremely terrified and shouted, saying with great anger, "Our forces, which have been exhausted by constant struggle, cannot stand alone. For this torrent of wheels." Then he turned to his army commander, and said with determination, "We will fight a decisive battle with the forces in our hands, so order our brave officers to attack with their divisions, and convey to them my hope that each one of them will carry out his duty as a soldier of the eternal Thebes." Siknanara was aware of the horror that awaited him and his army, but he was a brave man with great faith. He did not hesitate for a moment, looked at the sky and said in a clear voice, "O Lord Amun, do not forget your loyal sons." Then he ordered the force of the chariots surrounding him to attack, and he rushed in front of them to meet his enemy. One of the most horrific battles began, in which screams and neighs rose, helmets flew, heads fell, and blood flowed, but the valor of the Egyptians was of no use in resisting the fast armored wheels, so they killed them in a devastating manner, and reaped them like wildfire. Siknanara fought a glorious fight, neither despairing nor failing, and it seemed for an hour, it is as if he is the Lord of Death choosing for himself whomever he wants from among his enemies. The battle continued until the afternoon, and there the shepherds appeared to be prevailing, so they were motivated to strike the final blow, and a large chariot attacked, guarded by a mighty force, led by a strong, long-bearded, bright white knight riding a chariot of Siknanara, and the ranks opened towards him with extraordinary valor. And the king realized the purpose of the intrepid knight, so he rushed towards him until they faced each other, and then they exchanged 2 massive blows with their spears. Each of them received the blow directed at him with his shield and was motivated to fight. Siknanara saw his rival unsheathing his sword, so he knew that he was not content to try his luck, so he unsheathed his sword and rushed towards him, and in that terrible moment an arrow lodged in his forearm, so his hand trembled and the sword fell from it. Many of the king's guards shouted, "Beware, my lord, beware." But the rival was quicker to attack him out of caution, so he directed a massive blow to his neck with the utmost of his strength, and it hit its target, and a deep pain appeared on his brown face, and he stopped resisting, defeated, so his enemy seized it with his right hand. He threw a spear at him forcefully, and it landed on the king's left side. He staggered in shock and fell to the ground, and shouting rose from all sides, so the Egyptians said, "Oh my God, the king has fallen, defend your king." The enemy commander shouted, smiling with a victorious smile, "Finish the disobedient rebel, and do not spare any of his men." The fighting intensified around the fallen king's body, and a spiteful knight pounced on him, raised a sharp axe, and brought it down on his head, knocking off the double crown of Egypt and exploding from it. The blood was like a fountain, and he bent down with another blow above the right eye, so the bones were shattered and the brain was scattered in a hideous state. Many wanted to get something from that bloody banquet to cure their illness, so they attacked the corpse and directed crazy, cruel stabs at it, hitting the eyes, mouth, nose, cheeks, and chest, tearing the corpse apart and drowning it in a sea of blood. Bibi was fighting at the head of what remained of his soldiers, defending the enemy forces flocking to the spot where his master had fallen. The people became desperate in the fight, and life became easy for them. They all resolved to be martyred in the place that had been drenched by the blood of their valiant king. They continued to fall, man after man, until he caught up with them. It was evening, and the universe was dressed in mourning, so the two teams stopped fighting, exhausted by fatigue and heavy with wounds. 11. The soldiers went out with torches searching for their dead and wounded, and Commander Bibi was standing next to his will after exhaustion had taken the best of him, his heart turning to the corpse whose bright blood stained the field. So he heard the voice of a commander saying, "Wow! How did the great battle end so quickly? Who would believe that we lost most of our forces in one day? How was it possible to defeat the tough soldiers of Thebes?" Another voice, which sounded like a rattle from exhaustion, said to him, "These are the irresistible wheels. They have destroyed all of Thebes' hopes." Commander Pp called them, saying, "Soldiers, have you done your duty towards the body of Siknanara? Let's look for her among the corpses." A shiver ran through their worn-out souls. Each of them took a torch and followed Bibi silently, their tongues held together by deep sadness, and they dispersed in the spot where the king had fallen, their ears deafening to the groans of the wounded and the ravings of the fevered, and Bibi could hardly see the sadness and pain before him. And could hardly believe it. He was truly searching for the body of Siknanara, and it was difficult for him to acknowledge that the Battle of Thebes had come to such a miserable end. He used to say with tears streaming from his eyes, "Bear witness, O land of Hyksos, and admire. We are searching for the body of Siknanara among your dunes. Be gentle with it, and let it be a comfortable bed. For its injured ribs, did it not fall in sacrifice for you and the good land? Alas, sir! Who is there for Tiber after you? Who do we have except you?" He remained in confusion for a while, then he heard a voice shouting, saying, "Comrades, come, here is the body of our Lord." He ran towards it with the torch in his hand, and his eyes were terrified by the horror that he would see. When he reached the place of the body, a loud scream escaped from his mouth, in which pain was mixed with anger. The king of Thebes saw a distorted mass of torn flesh, protruding bones, and spilled blood, and the crown was thrown next to him. He shouted angrily, "Oh, the crows of the world! They have done what wolves would do to the corpse of a ferocious lion, and it will not harm you if they tear apart your pure body, for you have been revived as a king should be. May the kings of Thebes live, and die the death of a valiant hero." He shouted to those around him who were stunned by grief, "Bring the royal howdah, come on, Nyam." Some of the officers brought the howdah, and they all participated in lifting the body and placing it on it, and Pipi lifted the double crown of Egypt and placed it next to the king's head. Then he laid down the body, and they carried the howdah in painful silence, and walked with it towards the ill-fated camp, and placed it in the tent that had lost its protector and master forever. And all the commanders and officers who had escaped death were standing around the howdah with their chins lowered, exhausted by depression, and their eyes clouded by deep sadness. Bibi turned to them in a strong voice, "Wake up, comrades, and do not give in to sadness. Sadness has no bringer. It will rush to us, and perhaps it will make us forget our duty towards his body, towards his family, and towards our country for which he was killed. The incident has occurred, but the tragedy has not finished its chapters, so we must remain steadfast in our positions, so that we can fully perform our duty." So the men raised their heads, gritted their teeth with determination and strength, and looked at their leader with a look as if they were promising him death. Bibi said, "The truly brave is the one whose duty is not forgotten by disasters. It may be right to acknowledge that we lost a good battle, but our duty is not over yet, and we must prove that we are worthy of an honorable death, just as we were worthy of an honorable life." They all shouted, saying, "Our king has set an example for us, and we will follow in his footsteps." Bibi's face lit up and he said happily, "You are saluted by brave soldiers. Now listen to me. Only a few of our army remain, but tomorrow we will fight the battle against them until the last man, and as a result of our fighting, we will hinder the advance of Apophis until the chances of survival are created for the Siknanara family. As long as the members of this family are alive, the war between us and the shepherds will not end, even if it calms down. In the fields for a while, I will leave you for a day to fulfill my duty towards this corpse and towards its valiant descendants, and then I will return to you before dawn, so that we may die together on the battlefield." He asked them all to pray in front of the body of Siknanara, so they knelt and immersed themselves in fervent prayer, and Pepi concluded his prayer by saying, "O merciful Lord, envelop our valiant king with your mercy in the presence of Osiris, and write for us a happy death like his, so that we may meet him in the Western world with faces that are not ashamed to meet him." Then he called some soldiers and ordered them to carry the howdah to the pharaonic ship. He turned to his companions and said, "I entrust you to the Lord and see you soon." He walked behind the howdah until they put him in the cabin. Then he said to them, "When the ship reaches Thebes, take him to the temple of Amun, place him in the sacred hall, and do not answer anyone who asks you about him until I meet you." The commander returned to his wheel, and ordered the driver to proceed to Thebes, and they set off to plunder the land. Thebes was laying down its eyelids to sleep, under the veil of darkness that covered its temples, obelisks, and palaces, oblivious to the momentous events taking place outside its walls. So, he headed toward the pharaonic palace, and the guards announced his presence. The chief chamberlain came quickly, returned his greeting, and asked him anxiously, "What is behind you, Commander?" Bibi said in a tone that indicated alarm, "You will know everything in due time, Grand Chamberlain, and now ask permission for me to appear before the Crown Prince." The Chamberlain left the room uneasy, then returned after a short time saying, "His Highness is waiting for you in his private suite." So the commander went to the Crown Prince's suite and entered him in the reception hall. He prostrated himself in his hands, and the prince was astonished by the unexpected visit. When Bibi raised his head and saw the prince's pale face, withered eyes, and swollen lips, he became anxious, and asked, as his usher had asked before, saying, "What is behind you, Commander Bibi? There must be something important that prompted you to leave the field at this time." The leader said in a voice whose tone indicated sadness and gloom, "My lord, the gods, for a reason whose wisdom is hidden from me, are still angry with Egypt and its people." Then these words came from the prince's soul in the position of the hand grabbing the neck, and he realized the sad news it indicated, so he asked in concern and alarm, "Has our army been struck by a disaster? Does my father ask for an extension?" He knocked on Bibi and said in a low voice, "Alas, my lord, Egypt has lost its shepherd on this dismal evening." Prince Ahmose was startled, standing up and shouting at him, "Was my father really injured?" Pepi said in his heavy, sad voice, "Our king Siknanara fell while fighting at the head of his soldiers like mighty heroes. This noble and immortal page has been turned from the record of your great family." Ahmose said, raising his head, "Oh my God, how did your enemy gain power over your loyal son? Oh God, what is this disaster that is befalling Egypt? But what is the point of complaining? This is not the time to cry. My father has fallen and I must take his place. Be patient, Commander Bibi, until I return to you in my military uniform." But Commander Bibi quickly said, "I did not come here, my lord, to call you to fight. The matter has been decided, and I am sorry." He looked at him with a sharp, harsh look and asked him, "What do you mean? There is no point in fighting. Has our brave army been destroyed?" Bibi bowed down and said with great sadness, "We have lost the decisive battle in which we had hoped to liberate Egypt, and the basic strength of our army has been destroyed. No real benefit will be expected from the fighting, and we will only fight to give the family of our martyred king time to escape. Do you want to fight until we flee like cowards, leaving our soldiers and our country prey to the enemy? Rather, it is the flight of wise men who appreciate the consequences and look to the distant future, and accept defeat if it occurs, then withdraw from the field for a while, and then they do not have time to gather their scattered forces and attack their enemy again. My lord, go ahead and invite the queens of Egypt, and let the matter be a consultation." Prince Ahmose called in Chamberlain and sent him for the queens. He walked back and forth, alternating with sadness and anger, while the commander stood before him and did not say a word. The queens, Tututuri and Ahatepe Festakimos, came hastily, and when they saw Commander Pepi bowing to them in greeting, they saw displeasure on his face. Ahmose, despite his pretending to be calm, felt fear and confusion, and their eyes became blurry. Ahmose was alarmed, so he invited them to sit down, and said, "Ladies, I called you to tell you sad news." He waited a moment so as not to surprise them, but they were terrified, and Thotisheri said anxiously, "What is behind you, Commander Bibi? How is Maulana Siknanara?" Ahmose said in a shaking voice, "Grandmother, your heart has intelligent feelings and sincere intuition. May God strengthen your hearts and help you bear the tragic news. My father, Siknanara, was killed in the field, and we lost the battle." He turned his head away from them so that he would not see their pain, and said as if he were speaking to his grieving soul, "My father was killed, our armies were defeated, and all of our people were doomed to suffer pain, from the lowest south to the far north." Thotisheri couldn't help it, so she exhaled a hot breath as if she had picked up crumbs from her liver, and she put her hand on her heart while saying, "How badly this old heart is hurt." As for Ahotep and Sechemos, their heads became heavy, and their eyes filled with hot tears, and had it not been for the presence of the leader among them, they would have sobbed loudly. Pepe stood in the midst of that all-encompassing sadness, silent, with a broken heart and weakened of all his senses. He was saddened by wasting time in vain, and he feared that his master's family would lose the opportunity to escape. He said, "O queens of my master's family, be brave and be patient, for even if the grief is greater than the consolation, then the hour is better with wisdom and not surrendering to sadness, and I ask you, in memory of my martyr lord, to hold back your tears with patience, and pack your bags. For there will be no good place in a safe resting place tomorrow." So Thotisheri asked him, "And the body of Siknanara?" "Rest assured, my lady, I will fully fulfill my duty towards her." So I asked him again, "Where do you want us to go?" "Your Majesty, the kingdom of Thebes will fall into the hands of the invaders for a while, but we have another safe homeland in the country of Nubia, and the shepherds in Nubia will not covet because life is a jihad that is difficult for their luxurious souls. May it be a safe haven for you, in which you will have supporters from our people and followers from our neighbors, and there you will calmly think again, nurture the hope of the new future, and nurture it with patience and valor, until the Lord permits, and his beams of joyful light will pierce the darkness of this pitch-black night." Ahmose was listening to him calmly, and he said to him, "Let the family immigrate to Nubia, but as for me, I would prefer to march at the head of my army and share his share in life or death." The leader was worried, and he looked at his master with eyes of hope and supplication, and said, "My master, I will not be able to dissuade you from doing what you want, so I will leave the matter to your wisdom, and I only ask you to listen to me a little. My lord, the fighting today is in vain, and it means clear destruction, and Egypt will not benefit from your death, nor will your death alleviate some of its pain, but without a doubt, it loses by losing your life, an irreparable loss. Every hope of salvation depends on your life, so do not deprive Egypt of hope after depriving it of happiness. So make Nata your goal, and travel to it, and there you will have room to think, plan, and prepare means of defense and struggle. This war will not end as Apophis hopes, for a people like ours who lived as a generous master will not be able to endure humiliation for a long time, and Thebes will be liberated, my lord. In a near future, and your enthusiasm will not stop there, you will pursue the filthy shepherds until you expel them from your homeland. The age of that young day is imagining to my eyes in the darkness of the gloomy present, so do not hesitate and resolve with the resolve of wisdom, and now that I have shown you the path of truth, judge according to what you are a judge." Pepe stopped speaking, and his eyes did not stop pleading, and Thotisheri turned to Ahmose, and said in a low voice, "The leader has spoken the truth," so he followed his words. Then the miserable commander felt the dew of hope, and his heart was revived with joy, and Ahmose was ashamed and did not say a word, so Bibi said, and he was lying for the first time in his life, "As for me, my lord, I will join you after a while. I have 2 sacred duties before me, to take care of the body of my lord, and to supervise the fortification of the walls of Thebes. Perhaps, through successful resistance, she will bargain for surrender on the best terms." The queens could not control it, so they burst into tears, and Pipi was overcome with emotion and said, "We must face our ordeal with courage, and let Siknanara set a good example for us, and let us always remember, my lord, that the chariots are the cause of our defeat. If one day you attack the enemy, let the chariots be your equipment, and now I will go and call the slaves to carrying the precious gold of the palace and its weapons, which are indispensable." Commander Pepe said these words, and then left. 12. A comprehensive movement of activity arose in the palace, and all its rooms were illuminated, and the slaves proceeded to carry clothes, weapons, and boxes of gold and silver, and take them to the pharaonic ship in a sad silence, under the supervision of the chief chamberlain. Meanwhile, the pharaonic family was waiting in King Ahmose's room, covered in gloom and silence. Its noble members lowered their heads, their eyes darkened with despair and sadness, and remained in this state for a while, until the chamberlain, Hoa, entered upon them and said in a low voice, "It is all over, my lord." The bailiff's word fell from their ears like an arrow from the neck, and their hearts skipped a beat. They raised their faces in amazement, and they exchanged looks of despair and depression. Is everything truly over? Has the hour of farewell arrived? Is this the last era of the pharaonic palace, glorious Thebes, and eternal Egypt? Will it be forbidden for them tomorrow to see the obelisk of Amenemhet, the temple of Amun, and the wall with the 100 doors? Will Thebes be oppressed by them today, and tomorrow its gates will be opened for Apophis to ascend its throne and control its necks? How do the guided become lost, the masters become fugitives, and the owners of the house become immigrants? Ahmose saw that they were not moving, so he stood up slowly and muttered, saying in a low voice, "Come, let us bid farewell to my father's room." So they stood up, and the family walked with heavy, faltering steps to the late king's room, and they stood in front of its closed door, fearful, not knowing how to break into it without permission, or how to throw it abandoned. Ha took a step forward and opened the door. They entered, preceded by their hesitant breaths and hot exhalations. Their gazes were fixed gently and tenderly on the great court, the soft seats, and the elegant tables. Their souls wandered around the king's prayer room and the beautiful sanctuary, on which was carved his image, kneeling before the Lord Amun. They all imagined him sitting on the throne. His Diwan, leaning on his pillow, smiled at them with his sweet smile, and invited them to sit, and they all felt his spirit overwhelming them and circling them, so their sad souls soared in the sky of memories, memories of motherhood, marriage, and sonship, their effects mixed with their deep sighs and flowing tears. Then Ahmose noticed the melting hearts around him, so he approached the image of his father and bowed down to it with reverence, kissed its forehead, and stepped aside. So Tututuri came forward and leaned over the beloved image, and kissed it with a kiss that left her with the pain of her bereaved and sad heart. And the whole family bid farewell to the image of their missing lord. Then they went outside into a sad silence as they entered. Ahmose, the chamberlain, saw her waiting for them, so he asked him, saying, "And you, Ha?" "It is my duty, my lord, to follow you like a faithful dog." So the king put his hand on his shoulder in thanks, and they all advanced through the colonnaded halls, the leader Pipi walking in front of them, and Ahmose walking at the forefront of his family, followed by the two young princes Ahmose and Nefertari, Fatishuri, then Queen Ahatepe, then Queen Sechemose. And everyone followed the chamberlain Hor, and they went down the stairs to a corridor. The pillars, and they ended in the garden, and they were accompanied on both sides by slaves carrying torches and lighting the way for them. They reached the ship, and moved to it one by one until it included them all. The separation became intense, so they took a look of farewell. Their eyes were lost in the darkness that had descended upon Thebes, as if it were wrapping it in a mourning garment, and their hearts were torn. Their chests cracked, and the pain of nostalgia squeezed their broken hearts, and the silence encompassed it, as if they had dissolved into the darkness, and Pepe stood in their hands, not saying a word, not daring to break this sad silence, until the king became aware of his presence, so he sighed and said to him, "The hour of farewell has arrived." Bibi said in a sad, trembling voice, while his emotions were intensely overwhelming, "My lord, I wish death would have overtaken me before I took this position. Let my consolation be that you are walking in the glorious path of the Lord Amun and Thebes, and I see that the hour of farewell has truly arrived, as you say, O my lord, so continue, may the Lord protect you with his mercy, and he entrusts you with the eyes of his care, and I hope that my life will be extended until I witness the day of your return as I witnessed the day of your migration, so that my heart will be happy to see my dear Tiber again. Farewell, my lord. Farewell, my lord. Rather, go to the meeting. Yes, to the meeting, my lord. He approached his master and kissed his hand, and he was still struggling with his emotions so as not to wet his generous hand with his tears. He kissed the hand of Tutishuri, Queen Ahatepe, Queen Sechemos, Crown Prince Ahmose, and his sister Princess Nefertari. Then he hugged the hand of the Chamberlain Hor affectionately, bowed his head to everyone, and left the ship. In silence and amazement. On the steps of the garden, he stood and watched as it began to move as it struck the oars in the water, and began to move away from the shore slowly and slowly, as if it felt the weight of the sadness of those on it, and they had gathered on its wall, bidding farewell to their beating souls, and he let go of his control, and he cried. And surrendered to crying until his body convulsed. He continued to follow the dear ship as it sank into the darkness until the night swallowed it up. Then he sighed from deep in his chest, and remained as he was, not knowing how to leave the shore. He felt lonely, as if he had fallen alive into a deep grave. Then he slowly turned from his position and returned to the palace with slow, plodding steps. And he was muttering, saying, my lord, where are you? Where are you, gentlemen? O people of Thebes, how can you sleep when death is hovering over your necks? Arise. Siknanara has been killed and his family has emigrated to the ends of the earth while you are sleeping. Arise. The palace has been emptied of its masters. And Thebes has bid farewell to its kings. And tomorrow an enemy of yours will ascend your throne. How do you sleep? Arise. Humiliation is behind the walls. Then the leader took a torch and walked through the halls of the palace sad, moving from one wing to another. He found himself in front of the throne room. He headed towards it and crossed its threshold while saying, excuse me, my lord, for entering without permission. He advanced with feeble steps in the light of his torch between the two rows of seats that were things got complicated and concluded, until he reached the throne of Thebes, knelt down, then prostrated himself and kissed the ground between his hands. Then he stood before him sadly, and the light of the torch was reflected on his red, trembling face, and he said in a loud voice, indeed, a beautiful and immortal page has been turned, and we will be the dead. Tomorrow, make the people of this valley that has never known night happy, O throne. I am saddened to inform you that your friend will not return to you, and that your heir has gone to a far country, and as for me, I will not allow you to be the home of the words that will make Egypt miserable tomorrow, for Apophis will not sit on you. May you be folded as your master was folded. Pepe had intended to call soldiers from the palace guard, to carry the throne to where he wanted. 13. The soldiers carried the throne as they were ordered, and placed it on a large chariot, and the leader led them to the temple of Amun. There they carried the throne again, and they walked behind their leader, preceded by some priests, to the sacred hall. In the holy resting place, close to the Holy of Holies, they saw the pharaonic hostage surrounded by soldiers and priests, so they placed the throne next to it, and astonishment appeared on the faces of the priests who knew nothing of the matter. Pepe ordered the soldiers to leave, and asked for the presence of the high priest. The priest was absent for a short time, then returned. He followed the priest of Amun, who appreciated the danger of the night visit, so he came quickly and extended his hand to the commander, saying in his calm voice, "Good evening, Commander." Bibi said in a tone that indicated concern and alarm, "Your nights have been long, Your Holiness. Will you permit me to be alone with Your Holiness?" The priests heard what he said, so they quickly withdrew from their aspiration and anxiety until the place was empty. The high priest noticed the howdah, and annoyance appeared on his face, and he said to the leader, "What brought the carriage here, and what is this howdah, and how did you leave the field at this hour of the night?" Bibi said, "Listen to me, Your Holiness. There is no benefit to be gained from slowing down, or from underestimating what we are in, but you must listen to me until the end so that I can convey to Your Holiness what I have, and proceed with my duty. An incident has occurred that will be remembered forever, accompanied by pain and pride. Together, and no wonder, we lost the Battle of Egypt. Our king was killed defending his homeland, his pure body was torn apart by treacherous hands, our royal family was forced to abandon Thebes, and the people of Thebes will wake up and find no trace of their kings or their glory. Wait, Your Holiness, wait. It is almost midnight, and my duty calls me to hurry. This howdah carries the body of our king Siknanara and his crown, and here is his throne. This is our national heritage. I entrust it to you, O priest of Amun. In order to preserve the body and deposit it in a safe place, and to keep these remains in Hyksos stable. Now I entrust you to the Lord, O priest of Thebes, which will not die even if it is severely wounded. The priest was about to interrupt the leader out of his extreme annoyance, but the leader did not allow him, so he fell deeply silent and froze completely, as if he had lost all of his senses. Pepe realized the astonishment and pain the man was suffering, so he said, I entrust you to the Lord, Your Holiness, reassured that you will do your full duty to the sacred relic. The commander turned from him to the howdah, and bowed in reverence until he covered his cover and gave him a military salute. Then he retreated backwards, his tears concealing the howdah from his eyes, until he reached the stairs leading to the Hall of the Columns. He turned his back and walked quickly, without turning to anything, out of the temple, and he felt that he had. It is time for him to join his officers and soldiers, and launch the final attack with them, as he promised them. However, his absorption in his duties did not make him forget something that came to his memory until he felt a wink in his heart that could not calm down. He mentioned his family, his father, his wife, and his young son, Ahmose, and all of his family, who were included in his farm on the outskirts of Thebes. What a long journey! He could not cross the road to his farm at night, and if he did, he would not be able to fulfill his promise to his soldiers, and they would think that he was a fugitive. He would die without seeing a farewell look on the faces of father and Ahmose. There was something heavier on his heart than this, and he was wondering sadly, should he leave? Are shepherds a landowner on his land, or an owner of money for his money? Tomorrow the masters will be displaced or killed in their homes, and Abana and Ahmose will be left without a helper. The man was fed up, and his heart longed for his home and his family, but his heart was on a path, and his iron will was on the path of someone else. He sighed with regret as he said, "Let me write a letter to her," and he stretched out. In his haste, he wrote a piece of paper and wrote to Mrs. Ibana, offering her greetings and entrusting her to the Lord, and praying for his son's salvation and happiness. Then he told her what had happened, and what had become of the army and its king, and he told her of the migration of the royal family to an unknown place, and he did not mention Nubia due to the wisdom he wanted, and he advised her to gather what she could use his money. And she and her son and the family and neighbors who followed her would flee outside Thebes, or to the poor neighborhoods, where they would mingle with the common people and share their fates. Then he blessed her and his son, and concluded his book by saying, "We will definitely meet, our father, here or in the underworld." And he gave the book to its driver. He commissioned him to take him to his rural palace and hand him over to his husband. Then he jumped into his wheel and took a last look at the temple of Amun and the city sleeping in darkness, and chanted from the bottom of his heart, "My Lord, save your country. Farewell, Thebes." Then he unleashed his 2 horses, and they galloped along the northern road. 14. The commander arrived at the camp after midnight, and the wounded army was asleep. He went to his tent and lay down on his bed in exhaustion, saying, "Let us rest for a while so that we may die a death worthy of the commander of Siknanara's forces." He closed his eyelids, but some of his shadows formed a thick film between his head and sleep, and he imagined that he had ghosts of the horrors that afflicted him day and night. He saw the archers throwing the wheels that were set upon them like a torrent, and his master Siknanara falling to death with the spear at his side, and Camus raging in anger, then surrendering in grief, and Tutishiri moaning from the wound of her old heart, and the farewell of our father and young Ahmose. And those overcast clouds that gathering on the southern horizon. Then the images mixed together in what looked like waves, thinning and crashing without him realizing it, and sleep flowed to his eyelids. He woke up at dawn to the sound of the trumpet, and he felt a strange activity that was inconsistent with the fatigue, exhaustion, and light sleep he had encountered. He went outside his tent, and in the stillness of dawn he heard a movement rising throughout the camp, and he saw the ghosts of men coming towards him. From their voices he recognized his brave and loyal officers, so he welcomed them with a warm welcome. They had done a great job during his absence, and one of them said, "We sent the wounded in boats to Thebes, as well as the lightly injured, so that they could join the forces defending the walls of Thebes. There is no doubt that Thebes will defend itself well until it obtains the best conditions." Another very enthusiastic officer said to him, "We, the people of the south, make life easy for us in times of adversity. There is no man among us who does not lose patience while waiting for the final battle." A third said, "How much our souls desire martyrdom in this holy spot, which was watered by the pure blood of our king." Pepe praised them beautifully, and told them what had happened in Thebes due to the migration of the pharaonic family, but he did not mention to anyone the place to which they were headed. The officers were greatly affected, and they cheered for King Ahmose, his crown prince, and Holy Mother Tetisheri. The shadows of darkness disappeared, and the clear light was reflected in the sky of the horizon, so the ranks of the soldiers were organized in preparation for the battle of death, and the king of the shepherds was aware of what had happened to the army of the Egyptians after the killing of their king. So he wanted to stun them with forces that paralyzed all resistance, so he prepared at the head of his forces of chariots and archers, to eliminate with one blow the small army that was blocking his way. When the two groups saw each other, the fighting began, and the choppy sea connected with the clear stream, and the army of Apophis closed in on the Egyptian army, and the wheel of death turned, and the Egyptians exerted all their human power of valor and heroism, but they quickly fell, hero after hero, and were trampled upon. The horses' legs were hard, and it seemed to Pepe's eyes that the battle would end quickly, especially when he saw many commanders and officers fighting, and he saw his right wing being quickly destroyed, and the enemy was about to surround them, so he wanted to end his life with a noble ending, and he looked around his enemy's army. So he remained steadfast. On his heart, where the Hyksos flag fluttered over Apophis and his senior commanders, among whom was undoubtedly the killer of Siknanara, he made him his target, and ordered his guards to follow him to defend his back. Then he ordered his driver to rush. And it was a sudden movement that the cautious enemy himself had not expected, and his wheel avoided the wheels that were exposed to it. It sent its arrows into the hearts of the archers, and it approached Apophis until most people realized its purpose, so they shouted in anger and fear, and Pepe and those with him fought against those mad with the love of death, and death overshadowed them for a long time until they broke ranks to the front of Apophis and his commander. And there Pepe found himself surrounded by enemy knights from on every side. He saw hundreds of men standing between his chariot and the king, so he fought violently, with blood flowing from his face, neck, and legs, until his enemy thought he was something that could not die, and arrows, spears, swords, and daggers attacked him, and he fell. As Siknanara later fell, with his brave guards, and the army was in a roar. From his massive attack, and the fighting in the field was at its end, and the Egyptians were breathing their last, so Apophis ordered to stay away from the body of the man who attacked him through his close ranks. He got off his wheel and got closer to it, until he stood on top of the corpse and looked at the arrows embedded in every piece of it, like a hedgehog's hair. Then he shook his big head laughing. He said to those around him, "He died a death worthy of our bravest men." 15. Thebes woke up as usual, not knowing anything about what had been written for her in the tablet of destiny, and suddenly the villagers were carrying the wounded, coming from the field. People gathered around them and asked them a lot of questions. He told them the true news, so they told them that the army had been defeated and Pharaoh had been killed, and his family had emigrated to an unknown place. He was astonished. The people exchanged looks of denial and annoyance, and the news spread throughout the city, spreading chaos and unrest in it. People left their homes, ran to the roads and markets, and gathered in government houses and the temple of Amun to socialize with the group and listen to their leaders. As for the nobles and rich owners of estates and palaces, they abandoned their estates and palaces in panic and fled. Groups to the south or disappeared into the folds of slums. Other sad news came about the fall of Kasi and Shenhu. and that the armies of shepherds were advancing towards Thebes to lay siege around it and force it to surrender. The 30 ministers, priests, and judges gathered in the hypostyle hall of the temple of Amun and consulted on the matter. They were all aware of the danger of the situation and sensed the approaching end and the futility of resistance, but they tended to surrender without condition or restriction, and they decided to stand behind their impenetrable walls, until they were promised to spare the blood of the people, except for Aman, who was very enthusiastic and seething with anger, so he said to them, "Never surrender Thebes, and let us resist until we die like our king Siknanara. The walls of Thebes cannot be stormed. If it is truly threatened, let us destroy the city and set it on fire, leaving nothing for Apophis to benefit from." Aman was roaring angrily, waving his hands as if he was preaching, but the men were not enthusiastic about his idea. Aman said, "We are responsible for the lives of the people of Thebes, and destroying it exposes thousands of them to homelessness, hunger, and misery. Let our goal, even though we lost the battle, be to alleviate the pain and limit the destruction." Meanwhile, the shepherds were attacking the northern wall relentlessly, and the guards were fighting for it with steadfastness and valor, and deaths were falling on both sides, and the ministers inspected the walls and were reassured of the resistance, but the enemy fleet attacked the Egyptian fleet after it received new reinforcements. And a heated battle took place that ended with the destruction of the Egyptian fleet. He besieged the shepherds' fleet west of Thebes, and landed many soldiers in its south. He laid his complete siege around the city, and attacked it from the north, south, and east with a violent attack. The defeat of the fleet was a fatal blow to all hope of prolonging the resistance, and threatened the great city with famine and thirst. The leaders saw no choice but to avoid the great disaster. They sent an officer to announce the cessation of fighting and ask permission for a messenger to come from the city to speak about the final terms of the handover. The officer returned with approval, so the fighting stopped in all the walls, and the leaders chose Aman, the priest of Amun, to be a messenger. The priest accepted it eagerly, and got into his carriage, which drove him towards the camp of the shepherds, weighed down and heartbroken. On his way, he passed through the various divisions lined up in strength, arrogance, and pride, with flags of every color fluttering over them. Then the carriage stopped, and he alighted in silence, and found greeting him some officers, led by a man. He was short in stature, with a heavy beard, and he recognized him at first glance. He was the betrayed messenger, the harbinger of misfortune who would bring destruction upon the kingdom of Thebes. The intended gloating was not lost on him, and the man seemed arrogant. He looked at Aman with the back of his eye and said without greeting, "Have you seen, O priest, what fate your prince has ended up with? You are very enthusiastic and speak well, but you have no intention of fighting, and your kingdom has been doomed to disappear forever." The chamberlain did not wait for a word, so he walked in front of him towards the king's tent, and Aman saw the tent like a pavilion with curtains drawn over it, and the thick white guards with long beards standing in front of it. Then he gave him permission and entered, and in the chest he saw King Apophis in the garb of the pharaohs and on his head the double crown of Egypt, and he was majestic. He looked sharp, white, and tinged with red, sporting a beautiful beard, surrounded by a halo of his commander, his chamberlains, and his advisors. The priest bowed to him in reverence, and stood silently awaiting his command. The king said in a sarcastic tone, "Welcome to the priest of Amun, who will no longer be worshipped in the land of Egypt." The priest looked down and did not say a word, so the king laughed loudly and asked him sarcastically, "Have you come to dictate conditions to us?" Aman said, "Rather, I came, O king, to listen to your conditions, as befits the leader of a people who lost their battle and lost their king. And I have only one hope, that you spare the blood of a people who have drawn their weapons only to defend their existence." The king shook his big head and said, "You would do well, O priest, to listen to me. The law of the Hyksos does not change over days and generations, and it is the law of war and power forever. We are white and you are black, we are masters and you are peasants. The throne, the government, and the emirate are ours, so tell your people, who he works in our land as a slave and he gets his reward, and whoever rejects his soul should turn himself to a direction that pleases him in another land, and say to them, I would shed the blood of an entire country if any evil was directed against one of my men. And if you want me to shed the blood of the people, with the exception of the family of Siknanara, then let him come. To your masters, with the keys of Thebes, they prostrate themselves. As for you, O priests, return to your temple and close its doors on you forever." Apophis did not want the interview to extend beyond this, so he stood up to signal its end. The priest bowed again and left the place. Thebes drank the cup until it was drunk, so the ministers and judges carried its keys and went to Apophis and prostrated themselves before him. Thebes opened its gates and Apophis entered it at the head of his victorious invading armies. On that day, the king shed the blood of the family of the ruler of Thebes, and ordered the closure of the border between Egypt and Nubia. Then he celebrated the victory with a great celebration in which all the armies participated, and he divided the land and money among his men, so the south became his possession, both land and men.